I used to think it would be quite a good test of how well different people's interfaces were working if we actually kind of organized a international brain pong tournament. Monkeys could be playing against humans with EEG.
Take the journals out of it. We don't need the journals anymore. It's a yearly pong off between your various experimental animals. What's up, you scholars of enlightenment? So last week, tech entrepreneur Elon Musk revealed more from his latest moonshoot project, the Neuralink. Now, Neuralink, just to remind you, is a chip that's installed into the brain of an animal or a human that can record and wirelessly relay brain activity, and Musk claims will one day help us to create cognitively enhanced humans, wireless human-to-machine interfaces, and could even help the handicapped to walk. Now, he has released a new video that shows a monkey named Pager playing the classic game Pong wirelessly via the Neuralink. So to help us dig through the latest video and separate the fact from the fiction, we welcome back Professor Andrew Jackson. Professor Jackson, welcome back to the show.
Hello again.
Thank you for taking the time. Professor Jackson is a professor of neural interfaces at Newcastle University here in the UK, and his current work centres on developing a neural prosthesis to restore hand function following spinal cord injury and stroke, and the CANDO project, a multi-site interdisciplinary project to develop a cortical implant, for neural control of seizures. So who better to walk us through these very sci-fi sounding waters? So Professor Jackson, first up, what's going on in this video? How on earth can you train a monkey to play Pong with just their mind? What are the scientific steps going on behind the curtain here?
So this is an example of what's often called brain decoding. Now, what's going on is they're listening with the implant to the activity of a lot of neurons in the part of the brain that controls the monkey's hand and arm. And we've known for many decades that when you make a movement, the brain cells in those areas discharge action potentials. They fire these little spikes of electrical ionic current. And different brain cells prefer movements in different directions. So a particular brain cell might fire a lot of action potentials for a movement to the right. And if you record enough of these brain cells, you can do this process called decoding, where you basically listen to the brain cells and you infer the direction that the animal or the person is trying to move. The decoding process, I'd like to describe it, one method is a bit like an election, and all the brain cells that prefer right are voting for the right direction with their action potentials, and all the brain cells that prefer left are voting, and you count up the number of votes and you decide the overall sort of tally. And then if you can do that in real time, you can take that signal to control something else like a computer cursor on a screen. So that's, I think, the basic approach that they're using here, and that's sort of fairly well established. I mean, I would say they're doing it quite well. I think the pager, him or herself, is particularly doing it very well. I think, to me, one of the most surprising things about the video was how well monkeys can play Pong, whatever they're using to control it. Right? I mean, it would have been quite impressive if the monkey had just been doing that with a joystick. But yeah. So this is sort of quite impressive. That it's a good demonstration of brain decoding, but the idea itself is not particularly new.
So, as you sort of allude to there, we've seen examples of this in the past where we've had, brain activity decoded in monkeys or humans, and a decoder machine or a machine using that decoding algorithm has been able to play a game or drive a prosthesis. Although I've never seen, as we say, a monkey playing Pong. What leaps forward, if any, therefore, is the Neuralink demonstrating in this latest video? Is there anything new here and revolutionary, or is this a sort of rehash of things that have happened in the field before?
Yeah, so I have seen some of these computer games used before. I mean, it's worth pointing out, Pong is is interesting because it's a one-dimensional game. You can only go up and down, and that was why it was one of the sort of early computer games, because they didn't have very good controllers for computer games.
It's not quite Call of Duty yet. But
yeah. Well, interestingly, so I mean, I mentioned no names, but there was one brain machine interface group that had quite a lot of funding from DARPA, which is the US military, and their demonstrations all seemed to involve first-person shooters.
I see.
You wonder who the audience they were trying to appeal to was. But no, so I mean, I have seen some of these kind of ball bouncing games done with brain interfaces, and I used to think it would be quite a good test of how well different people's interfaces were working if we actually kind of organized a international brain pong tournament. Where, monkeys could be playing against humans with EEG.
Take the journals out of it. We don't need the journals anymore. It's a yearly pong off between your various experimental animals. That sounds like a good idea. I'd go for that. If we're going to break the stranglehold of the journals, I think this is a good way to go.
But I mean, being serious, in terms of what is the innovative step, I mean, I think the really impressive thing here is there are no cables coming through the skin of the animal. The animal isn't wired up to big racks of equipment. The signals are being sent wirelessly from an implant that's under the skin. And again, I mean, that has been done to a limited extent before. Actually, a chap called Phil Kennedy, who is, again, one of the pioneers of the neural interface field, he had an implant that was tested in people, and I think he even tested it in himself, that went under the skin and would wirelessly send action potential signals from the brain.
Interesting.
But those implants were a fairly small number of channels. So this is an implant that I think is doing 1,000 brain signals from 1,000 electrodes, and I think this animal has 2 of them. So there's 2,000 channels being wirelessly sent through the skin. And that is that's absolutely state of the art, and is absolutely kind of progress in this field. And I said, I mean, I said in some comment that if you're inventing a new kind of device, if you're inventing, say you've invented a new telescope, right, it makes sense to point that telescope first at something where you know what you expect to see.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's a criticism of them that they're doing these kind of experiments that are reproducing work that's been done before. It's a really sensible way to validate the technology. So to me, the advance here is the technology advance, not necessarily the fact that you can decode these control signals from neurons in the motor cortex.
I remember when we turned on the LHC, the first few years were very much recreating results from previous experiments to make sure that the kit was working quote unquote correctly. So as you say, that's not necessarily a criticism. It's you need to do that validation and that calibration before you can move forward. So it sounds like the big leaps here potentially are the amount of electrodes that are on the surface, so the amount of information we're getting, the number of voters in the election, as you use in your analogy, and the fact that the animal isn't immobilized, it doesn't seem to be in distress. You don't have huge pieces of kit that you have to lug around while you're doing this equipment. So those are advances in the field. I wanted to chat a little bit, and maybe this goes back to the number of channels you were talking about, but what about the learning or training rate that we've got here for the Neuralink? So the video seems to suggest that the Neuralink can create a decoding algorithm for the monkey and allow it to play the Pong game wirelessly in only a few minutes.
After only a few minutes of calibration, we can use the output from the decoder to move the cursor instead of the joystick.
Which, when I've looked at things in this field, it seemed like they were training things for many months or many hours of animals playing certain games or doing certain activities. How impressive is that learning rate? Is it real? And how does it compare to previous experiments and previous methods of moving things around wirelessly?
So I don't think that's too different to what's been shown before. I think that the time-consuming bit is probably to get the monkey to learn to play Pong with its hand.
Yeah.
Right. That's a fairly kind of abstract thing for a monkey to normally do. But once you have an animal performing a behavior in the old-fashioned way with a joystick, the building of the decoder is actually fairly straightforward, and this kind of comes back to the idea that at least for the Pong game, right, this is a one-dimensional control, they also showed a two-dimensional cursor movement as well. But in the one-dimensional case, you only really need to look at kind of one movement that the animal makes to go up and one movement to go down. And then you have really all the information you need to, in future, kind of match that pattern of activity. The issue is that becomes much harder as you increase the number of dimensions that you want to control. And it's what is often called the curse of dimensionality, right? But if you have if you're thinking about a three-dimensional movement, you now have to sample many more different movements to get this training data that you need to build the algorithm. And actually, when we think of controlling our natural limbs and in future, the kind of the more science fiction-y sort of ideas of just thinking abstract thoughts directly to your computer or something, the space that the dimensionality of the space that you're trying to decode in gets bigger and bigger. So that's one reason why you might want to record more and more neurons, because you need to map a bigger dimensionality of neural space. But I think there's also a kind of more fundamental problem, which with this idea of decoding, which is you need to have this training data set where you first kind of map out that space as a training set for the algorithm to then learn to recognize those patterns in future. And I think that approach works well for kind of 1, 2, 3 dimensions of control. But I've sort of argued that it's hard to see how that will generalize to much more complex brain control applications.
I can't even envision it. Obviously, I'm not an expert in the field, but separating up from down seems like you do a cut at some point, and one is up and one is down, which seems reasonable to me. But then if you wanted to go up but 5 degrees to the left, or up or 5 degrees to the right, or 7 degrees to the left, or 8 degrees to the right, suddenly you're getting maybe signals that are very similar or jumbled up, and they're convolved together. And suddenly, as you say, when the dimensionality increases, the problem becomes much more complicated. I guess that's sort of the type of problem that you're alluding to, I guess.
Yeah, and I think there's some really interesting questions here, right? Because the other side of the coin. So what I've told you is what I call the biomimetic decoding approach, where you're just trying to get your interface to mimic what a natural arm would do with those signals, right? But the other sort of side of the coin is that this is the brain, and the brain is very good at learning to use new tools. And so another way of looking at this is we're just giving the brain a new tool to learn how to use. Like, when you learn to use a Nintendo controller to play a computer game, it doesn't necessarily matter whether the buttons are mapped out exactly in some kind of left, right, up, down relationship to what you're controlling. We can quite quickly learn to a new association of controls with a result on the screen. And so another way of thinking about this is that there is a learning process going on within the animal's brain that is helping them to figure out. And that's a really interesting current area of scientific research, the extent to which the brain can kind of completely rewire itself to produce new and abstract patterns of activity to control things that it wouldn't normally be controlling. And this goes back, actually, one of the first demonstrations of this was a chap I did some postdoctoral research with, but a chap called Eberhard Fetz, who in the 1960s showed that you could take pretty much any single brain cell and wire it up to a lever. And it didn't really matter what that brain cell was normally sort of like doing, or what its normal preferred behavior was. The animal could learn to ramp up the firing of that neuron to get this lever over to the right to get a reward. And so that's an example of neurofeedback, where actually in linking the brain into one of these interfaces, you change the pattern of activity. But again, that works very well with one neuron. But if you're talking about thousands of neurons, the monkey pager doesn't know which of the 100 billion neurons Elon Musk has decided to record. So, again, the animal has a very high dimensional problem to find within the space of patterns the brain could produce what are the right ones for controlling the interface. But, these are really interesting questions, or I find them very interesting, and they're things that I worked on, and many other people are working on in the field. And it's very, it's far too early to say this will work, this won't work. But I suppose that's a long way of cautioning that there is a difference between controlling one-dimensional thing on the screen to some of the more science fiction-y applications of this technology in future.
And that's a really nice segue into, so you use techniques like this, similar techniques like this, to help people with beneficial technologies or to drive prostheses, for example. What positive uses of this technology that we've seen displayed in this video could you envisage going forward into the near future and maybe the further future?
So, I mean, I've been interested for some years now in the idea of an artificial connection from the brain to the spinal cord to replace the pathways that might be lost after a spinal cord injury. And this is something that Elon Musk has also talked about, and I think this is one of the applications they're working on. So the device, the Neuralink device, I think doesn't just record signals; it can also send electrical stimulation through those electrodes. And so, in theory, if you put one of these in the brain and you put one of these in the spinal cord, you could decode the intention to move, even just up, down, and instead of sending that to the Pong bat, you could send that as electrical stimulation into the spinal cord to produce a movement up or down of the paralyzed arm. I think that there are lots of challenges to doing that, but one of the challenges is technological, and these kind of advances of technology will make it easier to envisage devices to restore movement like that. And it's worth saying, you probably for movement, I mean, movement isn't just signals going from the brain to the spinal cord and the muscles. We use a lot of sensory feedback. The proprioception, the sense of where our limb is in space, is vital part of being able to control our limbs. So you might also want to envisage a similar kind of Neuralink going back the other way, perhaps, that's sort of sensing, decoding from sensory neurons that are indicating where the limb is and sending that, bridging that back up to the brain. I think all of these things are in principle possible, but there's still quite a lot of work needs to be done to get these systems working usably, reliably, in a way that would actually benefit someone with a spinal cord injury.
So those are potentially long way off in the future. One suggestion was allowing people who are paralyzed to potentially move a cursor on a screen with their brain, which I guess is something that slightly more simple, maybe a quicker application in the near term. Why, if I might ask, are these experiments performed on pigs and monkeys? So what we've seen in the past is we had the previous video, which was mapping the intended movements of the legs of a pig. We now have Pager, who's a monkey, playing Pong. Is the brain structure of these animals very similar to humans? Is that why we see these animals used?
So I think the pig is quite a good animal for modeling the sort of size of the human brain and the size of the human skull. But the pig is not a particularly good animal for modeling the control of the forelimbs. So quadrupeds, rats, mice, pigs use their forelimbs mostly for locomotion. We as primates use our upper limbs for quite dexterous object manipulation. And it's not just that there's a difference in the way we use our forelimbs or our upper limbs. There's actually quite a different neuroanatomy. So there's a pathway from the motor parts of your brain down to the spinal cord that you use for controlling your hands. That monkeys, at least old world monkeys like macaques, have that pathway. But rats and mice, pigs don't have that pathway because they're not using their forelimbs for the kind of task. So it's in the past, in the the development of these kind of brain-machine interface technologies, there's actually only been about a 4 or 5 year lag between the first demonstrations of something in a monkey and then a comparable demonstration in humans. So we went from, say, brain control of cursors in, I think, 2002 in monkeys to 2006 in humans. And there was a sort of similar kind of timescale for control of robot arms. And I think that speed of translation speaks to the fact that actually, if you can do this in a monkey, at least for control of the arm, it's going to work pretty similarly in a human. They are on a fast trajectory here. They're making rapid progress. They went from rodents to pigs to monkeys, and they are claiming to want to get into humans pretty quickly. And I think that's feasible. It's worth saying that for a lot of other things, monkeys aren't necessarily good models. So if you want to think about an implant to decode language, it's going to be much harder to sort of test that out in an animal model. And I think that's one of the reasons why neuroscientists are very excited about technologies like this getting into people, because we can also start finding out what's going on in people's brains while they're doing things that are kind of uniquely human.
So there's a lot of things we can learn in terms of building the technology and the decoders and such, but eventually for the applications we're going to have a species specific trial run, I guess. That raises a little question that I was interested in. When we train something like the Neuralink or another decoding algorithm, do we need to do it for an individual animal or an individual person, or are the brain signals very similar between members of the same species or similar species?
So this is a really interesting question. At the level of the single neurons themselves, the decoder kind of has to be trained on an individual. So the problem is that when we talked about some brain cells that preferred up and some brain cells that preferred down, those brain cells are all mixed up in the same bit of brain, the same part of cortex. And so if you're going in, putting electrodes in, you don't have much control over whether you find an up cell or a down cell. You can't kind of specifically target them. So all of the decoding has to be done kind of a posteriori. You find your cells largely through luck. And then you find out whether they prefer up or down. And then you build this decoder. And so then if you move the device and put the device in someone else, it's going to be, those cells are all going to be mixed up. Having said that, there are also, so that's at the level of single brain cells, but at the level of the sort of larger brain areas and larger networks, there are, of course, similarities between the way your brain controls movement and the way my brain controls movement. And those similarities may partly come from, the fact our brains have followed a similar developmental trajectory. Our brains are constrained by the same kind of problems that our arms look the same. And so I think one of the really interesting areas at the moment of kind of current research is looking at whether, if you look at the sort of the higher structure of what all of these brain cells are doing, maybe there's commonalities. And to give you a kind of a sort of loose metaphor of this, when I speak and when you speak, our individual phonemes may hit slightly different pitches. And the real details of the sound might differ from you to me, and yet we can build artificial intelligence speech recognition that doesn't have to be trained to my specific voice or your specific voice, because we're both using a higher structure called language that has these sort of patterns in it that has information in it. So I think the really interesting question is whether there is an equivalent kind of higher level language going on in the firing of all of these neurons that is to some extent not specific to the individual. And that's a really open question that people are arguing. And so I'm not going to kind of come down on one side of the fence. But it may be that there's not, right? It may be that actually, the language evolved to allow us to communicate. So it makes sense that, language spoken by different people should be intelligible to an outside decoder. Brain signals only really evolved to be understood by other brain cells. So it may be that there's not the same kind of, general structures in there that would allow us to get information out. In which case, brain interfacing is going to be really held back, because everything you want to do, you're going to first have to do it kind of manually, and then train your decoder to understand what you want to do. And it's going to be like using a speech recognition system from the 1970s, where you have to basically kind of speak all the words you might want to speak in order to learn to understand you.
So it's an open question as to whether we're going to have to do that individual training, or we might be able to use some sort of higher level structure. So we're not too sure about that yet. As we sort of come towards the end of this, if we're going to move forward from pigs and monkeys into humans, what are the technological, the neurological, and the ethical hurdles to moving from monkeys into humans? Is this something that's covered by lots of legal ramifications, or is it just that a lot of humans wouldn't want this in their head, or they might be, worried about the impacts of having this thing installed?
So I think the technology hurdles are all the ones that the Neuralink team are working on, and they're all things that they are making really good progress on. So things like sort of wireless devices, so that you don't have to have stuff coming through the skin. They've also got this surgical robot to place the electrodes very, very accurately, avoiding blood vessels. So that, I think, is a sort of a fairly sort of straightforward, I mean, not straightforward, but it's a fairly clear-cut route to making it safer. And, let's not forget, there are plenty of devices that are in people's heads already. So a lot of people have stimulators, a bit like the pacemaker, that's implanted in the basal ganglia for treatment of Parkinson's disease. So there's a regulatory framework for how to show that a new medical device is safe to put in someone's head. I think the ethical stuff is somewhat more interesting, right? And it's interesting in a sort of a variety of ways. I mean, I think what we're seeing is this kind of tech companies moving into a space that has traditionally been within academia, and there's traditionally been, say, kind of academic standards of presenting your data in peer-reviewed publications, sharing technology. And it will be interesting to see the extent to which the Neuralink team kind of conform to the academic standards, because they might not be. And I think this becomes important, particularly important when you think about, say what happens to the data. So you're recording data from, presumably in a year or two, it will be data from someone's head. Is that information that they get, is that sort of, should we think of that as being just part of the company's kind of intellectual property, or do they have a kind of obligation to share that data more widely, make sure that data is being used in an appropriate way? Particularly, if people with spinal cord injury are volunteering to be participants in studies of implant technology, we need to then make sure that implant technology is properly being geared towards people with spinal cord injury, helping them, not necessarily just as seeing that as a stepping stone towards a longer term vision of controlling Teslas with our and then I think we have to, then also as a society, have a serious discussion about the extent to which we want, data that's coming from our brains to be kept private, to be used responsibly. And it's a conversation that we've not been very good at doing that with all the other kind of data that big Silicon Valley tech companies have been taking from us.
We just had another Facebook leak, I think, last week, didn't we? So
and we just need to be a little bit careful about rushing too far into a world where we're sharing what's going on inside our heads. So I think there are the ethical questions are really interesting. Probably we'd have to do a whole nother program on them. But it's good to get people talking about this at this stage, even though, like I say, those applications are still some way in the future.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense to get that conversation started. So, as I say, as we're coming to the end of this, Elon Musk, and you had a little bit of a sort of, 15 minutes of fame, maybe is the wrong way to put it. We're having a bit of a scuffle with him on Twitter, whatever it was, a few months ago. He's made some pretty bold claims again with this video. He said that the first Neuralink product will be able to enable someone with paralysis to use a smartphone with their mind faster than someone using their thumbs. And also that later versions of this will essentially allow paraplegics to walk again. Maybe we've covered that latter one. That's some way off. What about this idea of people being able to use computers faster with their brain than they can with their thumbs? How do you react to that claim?
Um, I don't think it's impossible. So there are, for instance, there's a time it takes for a signal to get from a brain to a muscle, and in principle, electronics could go faster than that. I think that that would probably be, I mean, with present technology, that would be in a very sort of limited scope. I think the other thing I sort of point to, so what we're talking about now is these applications of enhancement, right? So, and there's a difference between the enhancement application. We're going to get able-bodied people to do something faster or better than they could normally, versus what I think is a more kind of somewhat more sensible, pragmatic debate about an assistive device for someone who's paralyzed, where you are helping restore some function.
Who currently has lesser function than they might have had previously, for example, through an injury.
And the metaphor I use here, I guess, is prosthetic legs, right? So a leg is, in a way, a pretty straightforward bit of technology, right? We ought to be able to do legs with sort of robotics and this sort of thing. And yet, actually, if I offered you the choice, given the latest state-of-the-art prosthetic leg, would you like to have your own leg cut off to have it have this prosthetic leg installed? You wouldn't go anywhere near that, right? Because actually it turns out that legs are really quite complicated. And legs have evolved through millions of years to be really good at the job that they do. And thumbs are kind of the same, right? Thumbs have evolved to be really good at doing what they do. And so I'm a little bit skeptical that we're going to sort of anytime soon find that our brains have been made, or our limbs have been made sort of redundant by this technology. But I may be wrong. Elon and these people are visionaries looking over longer kind of time frames and larger scale of investment than I normally think about. So they might, but I think we always remember the technology visionaries who turned out to be right. But at the same time, we forget all of the visionaries who sort of said that we'd all have jetpacks by now.
So potentially, there's a little bit of hype and a little bit of advertising razzmatazz with that. That's perhaps they're some of the more unlikely sort of near goals that probably aren't going to come to pass, but could possibly.
I think the constraints you operate under as the sort of CEO of a company worrying about your share price are different constraints that you operate under if you're an academic trying to get a paper published in a peer-reviewed journal.
I think that's fair, and I think that's a nice way to put it. So, final question, because I don't want to keep you all morning. Thank you very much again for spending the time. Final question. What would you expect to see and hope to see going forward from the Neuralink team, and what should we be looking out for specifically, and from them, and in this fascinating field more broadly? What are the big signposts coming up? What are the steps that we should be watching out for?
So I think they're clearly on a trajectory towards doing human trials with this technology, and I think that's there's a regulatory process which I'm sure they'll follow. And my hope would be that they're able to implant the technology and show that it works safely and effectively in people as well as animals. I think that at the same time, I rather hope that they distribute the technology that they have to other groups and other researchers, particularly people doing experiments with animals. I think that the technology, the wireless aspects of it, the fact that it's a large number of channels, could both improve the science and also improve the welfare of animals used in science in laboratories around the world. And I suppose this is again where it's a little bit difficult because it's a private company. In the past, the examples of that would be technologies like what's called the Utah array, which was one of the first sort of recording electrode implants that went into people. But at the same time, the people developing that made very sure that technology was available to other scientists. And there are real benefits for that. You can start amassing large amounts of evidence and data around that technology, and people can do new experiments and come up with new applications for it. So I really hope that they take that route and they make this technology available, like I say, and I think it will improve science, it will improve animal welfare in science, and really ought to be a win-win situation. At the same time, putting the effort into showing that the device is safe for people. I'm sure that the technology as stands, if proved safe and effective, would already be useful for people who for example, have very few other options for communicating with computers and so forth.
Sounds good. Sounds like there's a lot of exciting work ahead and interesting things that we should keep an eye out for. Professor Jackson, thank you so much for taking the time again this morning to discuss this with me. I've learned a lot again. Really, really interesting, really, really fascinating. Where can people keep up with the work that you're doing? I know you're not on social media, which is, I wish I had followed your example. But where can people keep up with the work you're doing and the fascinating things that are going on in this field?
So please take a look at the website of our CanDo project, because we've put quite a lot of resources up there to describe the work that's going on there. So it's www.cando.ac.uk.
It will be down in the description, so everyone head over there and have a look at that fascinating project. Again, Professor Jackson, thank you so much for taking the time this morning. I know you're a busy man. I really, really appreciate it. And hopefully when the next bit of advertising comes out or something else fascinating happens in this field, because it seems like it won't be long until that does happen, we can get you back and have another chat.
No problem. Nice talking to you, Sam.
Really lovely chatting to you as ever, and have a great week.